There were unprecedented scenes that unfolded in the Oval Office at the White House on Friday after Donald Trump furiously berated visiting guest Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. It was a show of diplomacy, one that will go down in infamy. Both Trump and Vance, his vice president, publicly scolded and berated Zelensky almost as if he was a little child. Of course, Zelensky hurried out of the White House. He was told that the meeting will not happen. The minerals deal that he was there to sign will not happen until he wants peace. Zelensky then crossed over the Atlantic Ocean. He came into Europe, where he received a hero's welcome. European unity played itself out in London over the weekend. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, along with the French President Emmanuel Macron, chaired an emergency pan-European Ukraine meeting, and where they said that along with Ukraine, they will present a ceasefire plan to the United States. Starmer is still hopeful that the US and Donald Trump will back this peace plan. Others are not quite sure. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has rejected any calls for an immediate ceasefire in the ongoing war. He says he's still hopeful and still ready to sign the minerals deal with the United States, but he needs security guarantees. That is a no-go area for Donald Trump. What does Donald Trump want? He is committed that he wants a peace deal, a permanent peace deal with Russia. And whether or not the Ukrainians like it, whether or not the Europeans are in the room, he doesn't care, but he's going ahead with that peace deal with Russia. And more importantly, will the Ukraine war itself become a frozen conflict? Can Europe step in where America retreats? Can Europe put money where its mouth is? What happens to the conflict from here on out? First, a deep dive. I decode what is the fallout of those 50 minutes that we saw at the Oval Office on Friday night, and what the consequences are and how it will likely play out both in the battlefield and across diplomatic halls, both in Europe and in the US. It's the most dramatic piece of diplomacy you will ever see.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you?
It is the most riveting 50 minutes of live television involving world leaders.
You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
For the first 40 minutes, it went fine until this happened.
He broke this ceasefire. He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
And then from there, it was all downhill.
What you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have. You got to be more thankful, because let me tell you, you don't have the cards. With us, you have the cards.
President by both US President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
After this disaster of diplomacy caught on camera, Zelensky was asked to leave the White House, and Trump made it clear that Zelensky is welcome back to the White House only and only when he wants peace. It is clear that America under Trump is in no mood to back Zelensky or Ukraine. It's only a matter of days before America pulls the plug on funding Ukraine's war effort. So the question is, what happens next? From Washington, Zelensky went straight to London, where he received a hero's welcome. European leaders are rallying around Zelensky, with London playing host over the weekend to 18 top European leaders who met in an emergency session chaired by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. It was co-chaired by French President Emmanuel Macron. All European leaders who were part of the meeting have rallied support for Ukraine.
Can Ukraine win the war without America, Mr. President?
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that this is a crucial moment for European security. He urged all European countries to increase their support for Ukraine. Zelensky received a hero's welcome with loud cheers in the streets. He even got a private audience with the British monarch, King Charles III. Recently, Starmer had pledged to increase military spending in Britain to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. Other European countries are also likely to follow suit. The Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala has said that European countries need to increase their defense spending to at least 3% of GDP. Right now, most European countries spend less than 2% of GDP on defense. All leaders who were present there have pledged to increase their respective countries' defense spending. Macron has been talking about a common and joint European army to defend Europe's interests. The unsaid part is that for far too long, Europe has depended on America to take care of its security. No more. Certainly not with Trump in the White House. The UK and France have agreed to work on a plan which will stop the fighting, and this plan will later be discussed with the United States. Starmer has said that both him and Macron will go to the White House and try and convince Trump to agree to the plan. Starmer says no peace plan will succeed unless there is an American backstop.
The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground and planes in the air. Together with others, Europe must do the heavy lifting. But to support peace in our continent and to succeed, this effort must have strong US backing.
Some European countries are willing to send peacekeeping troops to Ukraine to enforce a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. But they need the United States to provide military support in case Russia violates the agreement, which is why Zelensky has been insisting on security guarantees. Trump, on the other hand, has said he's loath to giving these security guarantees and that he trusts Putin to honor any agreement that is arrived at. Europe could release about $200 billion in seized Russian assets. It could help liquidate this fund and use that money to fund Ukraine's continued war effort. Also, over the weekend, the UK announced $2 billion of additional funding to Ukraine to procure 5,000 air defense missiles. The first part of the proposed ceasefire involves stopping all air and naval attacks at the war front, also sparing any attacks on energy infrastructure either in Ukraine or in Russia. It is not clear yet whether Putin will buy into this peace plan. But here's where the trouble is. This has to be entirely backstopped by the United States. The flow of American weapons to Ukraine is expected to completely stop, perhaps as early as this week. Both of Trump's top foreign policy points persons, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, were on weekend TV, and they've been alluding to how the Trump administration is inclined that all American assistance to Ukraine be imminently revoked, particularly after the fiasco that happened in the Oval Office last Friday. Trump has declared himself neutral in the negotiations. What he wants and what he's been demanding from Zelensky is payback for the military assistance that America has given over the last 3 years to Ukraine. That was to happen in the form of a $500 billion minerals deal, which Trump and Zelensky were to sign at the White House last week until the diplomatic stool hit the ceiling. Trump also said that he's convinced that Zelensky does not want a peace before throwing him out of the White House. He also left a window open by saying that Zelensky can come back to the White House if and when he's ready for peace. Zelensky too left a window open by saying he still very much wants to sign the minerals deal with Trump. Since Russia's invasion in February 2022, the United States Congress has appropriated more than $180 billion to Ukraine. Of that, over $65 billion is in military aid, which has already been sent to Ukraine. An additional almost $4 billion have been authorized by the US Congress, but it's not been spent by Ukraine on the battlefield. About $58 billion of the total aid was spent in the US itself, and that boosts the American defense industry. It is clear that without American funding, particularly military funding, Ukraine will find it difficult to continue the war beyond the next few months. In fact, it could likely end as early as this coming summer. Europe might temporarily try to bridge the gap, but even Starmer and Macron realize that without America, Ukraine's war is pretty much over, and it will allow Putin to declare victory. What they are hoping to convince Trump is that Putin doesn't feel emboldened again to attack Ukraine. And in this, they're hoping to rally not just their European partners, but also hope that Donald Trump will see sense in this plan. So is 50 minutes of absolutely riveting live television diplomacy happening in the Oval Office? Joining us now to try and make sense of what exactly happened in those 50 minutes at the White House last Friday, and more importantly, what's next? What's the fallout? What are the consequences of that meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky? I'm now joined by Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago at the Department of Political Science. Thank you very much, Professor, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. What a piece of live television. I think Trump ended by saying that this would be great TV. When you first saw what was going on, what was your first reaction?
Well, I was shocked because I had just never seen anything like that. And it was amazing to see President Trump and Vice President Vance really fighting it out with President Zelensky on live television. You just don't see things like that. You know what happens behind closed doors, but it was quite shocking to see it out in the open.
So tell me, for about the first 40 minutes or so, it seemed to be going okay. Both men were making their respective points. At what point did you think it sort of spiraled out of hand and you said, uh-oh, this is not going where both parties wanted to go to?
Well, it's obvious that Vance asked a provocative question of Zelensky and things then exploded. I think what's going on here is that you have to understand that the British, the French, and the Ukrainians are working together to try to trap the Americans into giving a security guarantee with Putin. The British, the French, and the Ukrainians are trying to get that security guarantee. And you want to remember that on Monday of last week, Macron visited. On Thursday of last week, Starmer visited, and then on Friday, Zelensky came in. And all of the discussion these days is revolving around this mineral deal. And the mineral deal is designed to trap the United States into giving a security commitment in a very sort of indirect way to the Ukrainians. Article 4 of the agreement says there will be common protection of critical resources. This is the way they're trying to trap Trump and company. And Trump won't be trapped. And the truth is, Trump and Vance are sick and tired of playing these games with the Ukrainians, with the British, and with the French, and they won't give them what they want. And what happened is that all of the frustration on the Ukrainian side and on the American side just came about in those last 10 minutes. And that's really what's going on here.
So it's interesting you said it seemed to be going okay till Vance intervened and asked a couple of uncomfortable questions. And then, of course, it just spiraled from there. Now, this is a slightly more difficult one, but what's your best analysis when you saw that video far removed from the actual, from the Oval Office where all this drama was playing out? Do you think it was clear that Vance was sort of the attack dog here? He was going after Zelensky, and Zelensky, fell in for that. Do you think this whole thing was a set piece, that this was an ambush that was planned, or it just spiraled out of control and no one quite could figure out how to, save it?
I don't think it was an ambush, but I do think that Trump and Vance were committed beforehand to making it clear to Zelensky that there was not going to be a security guarantee and there were going to be negotiations with the Russians, even if the Ukrainians, the British, and the French didn't like that. And if you think about the position that Zelensky is in, he's in desperate straits. He's led his country into a war that has resulted in a catastrophe. And he's trying to figure a way out. And he thinks that security guarantee from the United States is absolutely essential, and he can't get it. So the level of frustration here is just enormous. And on the American side, I think that Trump and Vance are sick and tired of being castigated by the British, the French, and the foreign policy establishment in the United States and the Ukrainians for talking to the Russians. So you had a recipe here for disaster. And it took a while to happen. You know, it was only the last 10 minutes. The first 30 or so minutes were rather mild, certainly compared to what came after that. But it's not all that surprising if you think about it as to what happened on Friday.
Is the situation now retrievable? Both Starmer and Macron speaking over the weekend at the big conference that happened in London. Certainly Starmer seems very confident that he can get Trump back around. He in fact even said that both Macron and himself will be visiting the White House soon, and it is his hope that this thing will ultimately have an American backstop. Do you think it's retrievable?
No, I think it's not retrievable. I think Trump has made it clear that he's going to cut a deal with the Russians, and I think he's made it clear that he's not going to give a security guarantee to Ukraine, and that's not going to change regardless of what happened on Friday. And furthermore, if you look at the plan, the so-called peace plan that the British and the French came up with and they unveiled yesterday, it's not a serious proposal. You sort of wonder what planet these people are living on. It has a two-step set of propositions built into it. The first is that you're going to have a ceasefire for about a month. And then the British and the French and their coalition of the willing are going to put peacekeepers inside of Ukraine. The Russians have made it unequivocally clear there's going to be no ceasefire, number one. And number two, they've made it unequivocally clear they're not going to let British and French troops into Ukraine. They may come in, but the Russians will target them. So where do Starmer and Macron get off thinking that this peace plan stands any chance of working? And in addition, as I've said a number of times now, there's going to be no guarantee by the Americans, because Trump and Vance understand that this plan that Macron and Starmer have come up with is unworkable.
So what if the trade-off for the Americans is that you get whatever $500 billion worth of rare earth minerals from Ukraine?
Well, that was the deal, right? But the question you have to ask yourself is, what's the quid pro quo? What does Ukraine get? Ukraine thought if the United States got $500 billion, that it would be willing to provide protection for those critical resources, those mineral resources. And that would be, in a way, an indirect security guarantee. But the Americans have made it clear there's going to be no security guarantee. So the end result of this mineral deal is a one-sided agreement where the Americans get $500 billion and the Ukrainians get nothing. I can't understand why Zelensky would sign it. It would be remarkably foolish to sign it.
So the other thing with the Europeans is that there's a lot of, solidarity. Zelensky got almost like a hero's welcome in London. There were 18 European leaders. They've all sort of made verbal commitments that they're going to step up their defense spending, so on and so forth. Is it realistically possible, though, that now that, the Trump administration has said that they have no interest in continuing to fund this war, that that Europe can actually fill that void, that Europe can actually step up its defense spending so that Ukraine can continue fighting?
I want to be clear here. I don't think there is all that much unity right now. I think the Italians have made it clear to the French that they cannot commit Italian forces to deploy in Ukraine. And the Italians and the Germans have shown hardly any enthusiasm for the British and French plan. This is really very much a British and French peace plan. So I don't think there's a lot of European unity. And as relations with the Americans continue to spiral out of control, I think you'll see the centrifugal forces that are sitting there below the surface in Europe begin to manifest themselves. And I think there's going to be big trouble ahead. I think the idea that a united Europe is going to come to the rescue of the Ukrainians now that the Americans are divorcing themselves from the Ukrainian situation is not going to happen.
So what's your best guess of how this is likely to play out over the next, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks? So Putin and Trump go in, they make a deal, and then Trump says, okay, that's it, we're not funding Ukraine anymore. What happens after that?
Well, this is just my guess because it's very hard to tell what's going on behind closed doors, and I think that's what really matters, especially with regard to the Russians and the Americans. My sense is the Americans have effectively committed themselves to trying to cut a deal with the Russians. They know what the Russians' terms are for cutting a deal. They're very clear. Putin laid them out on June 14th of 2024. And one would think the Americans clearly understand what they are and have reached the conclusion that they have to accept Russian terms by and large. So I think that the Russians and the Americans will be able to reach an agreement. Then the question is, what happens with the Europeans and the Ukrainians? It's easy to imagine that the Europeans will ultimately go along because they can't do much to really help Ukraine. Whether the Americans can get the Ukrainians on board is another matter. So I think the Americans face a really difficult time, even if they can consummate a deal with Russia, getting the Ukrainians for sure, and maybe even the Europeans on board. So it's going to be tricky to get a meaningful peace settlement here.
So the fighting continues? I mean, Ukraine continues to fight on till the last Ukrainian standing?
That's the way they're talking. My sense is, look, if the Americans pull out their support for Ukraine, Ukraine is going to lose even more rapidly on the battlefield than it's now losing. And one would think at some point there'll be a ceasefire. There will not be a genuine peace agreement. It's very important to distinguish between a ceasefire / frozen conflict, sort of what you had at the end of the Korean War, versus a genuine peace agreement. What the Russians want, and I believe what Trump wants, is a genuine peace agreement where they not only shut down the Ukraine war, they get some meaningful security architecture in place in Europe so we don't have any more trouble in the foreseeable future. That's what Putin and Trump want. But I don't think you're going to get that. I think the war will end, but again, I think you'll get a ceasefire, not a genuine peace agreement. Let's face it, I hope I'm wrong, but when you look at all the factors at play here, it is hard to imagine getting a genuine peace agreement.
What happens to NATO? Do you think there's a fundamental rupture in the transatlantic alliance, or do you think that this episode can be put in the back burner and America and its European partners can continue to collaborate, provided, as Trump and Vance have been saying, that they raise their defense spending, which I think a lot of countries in Europe are now saying that they will?
I think there has already been a major rupture. I don't think there's much question about that. I think putting Humpty Dumpty back together again is not going to be easy. And in fact, I would argue it's impossible. I think the interesting question is whether the United States pulls so many troops out of Europe that its commitment to NATO, its commitment to Europe just disappears. For all intents and purposes, I think that is possible. I think Trump is radical enough in his approach to